and welcome to the BRSI Business and Economics series. My name is Andreas Wasmuht and I'm the convener for Business and Economics at the BRSI. Today's topic is universal basic income, which I'm going to be discussing with Dr. Neil Howard from the University of Bath. And clearly, this is a very, very fundamental and poignant discussion topic to be had, because now that the pandemic influences and consequences are sort of reaching the financial aspects of individual families across the world, this could well be a policy response that would help the most disadvantaged in society. So I'm delighted to be welcoming Dr. Neil Howard to the program.
Thank you very much. It's very, very nice to be here. I look forward to chatting.
Great. I mean, given the sort of fundamental nature of what we're currently facing, and the fact that this has a real impact, not just on people's health, but actually people's financial well-being and sustenance. Maybe you can start talking a little bit more about yourself first, and give us a bit more of a background what you do at the University of Bath.
Sure. I'm happy to do that, and then also reflect a little bit about why basic income might be a good idea at this time. So yes, my name is Neil. I'm a research fellow at the University of Bath. I research a number of things, including basic income. Broadly speaking, my work looks at experiences of poverty, marginalization, exploitation. So people who do some of the toughest kinds of jobs, and usually do so because they're very poor and excluded from mainstreams of society.
Yeah.
And I study policies that are intentioned to help them, but often fail. And I am proposing and studying an alternative, or a couple of alternatives, one of which is basic income. The sort of central premise of what I do is, if people do really bad work because they are poor, then why don't we just give them money so that they have the freedom to say no to the more exploitative or difficult or dangerous kinds of work?
Right.
Pretty intuitive, but nevertheless, for most of the mainstream policy establishment, not something that has been acted upon in the way that one might assume that it would be. So that's really the majority of what it is I do. I run a couple of research projects in a number of different countries, looking at what impact basic income and other sort of solidarity interventions can have in helping some of the more marginalized folks in the world have greater freedom in the labor market.
Okay, well, that's very modest of you, though, because, I mean, you actually organized an open letter to government recently, signed by 500 people, about universal basic income. So,
true.
maybe you can give some background to that letter and what you're trying to achieve.
Sure. So I mean, I wear a variety of different hats. The academic hat is the hat that I just spoke to you about, but outside of the university and very much related to my university work, I engaged in a variety of different sort of political and social actions. When this crisis hit and lockdown began, it became very clear very quickly to me, and I think people of all stripes, that this was likely to have pretty devastating impacts for people who don't have a huge amount of money in their pocket, who may live hand to mouth, who live paycheck to paycheck, and so on and so forth. All of which to me says that this is a historic moment in which an unconditional basic income, a universal basic income, would be a very, very sensible idea, simply because without money in their pocket, in a society in which you need money to survive, people are going to starve unless they get the money that they need. Unless, of course, the government enacts widespread rationing and food distribution, which is not currently on the cards. So, simple premise, if you need money to survive, you've got to be given the money if you can't access it otherwise. What was clear to me was that colleagues from all walks of life were sharing similar concerns and similar analyses. And so I decided to put together an open letter, beginning with academic colleagues, and then that spread to political figures as well.
Good.
In the end, but at this point, it's well over 1,000 signatories. But by the time it was published in The Independent, it was signed by sort of thought leaders from across the academic sector, as well as political figures and civil society figures, calling for the institution of an emergency basic income at once to catch all of those who will be falling through the holes in the existing safety net.
Right.
And subsequent to that, I was involved in organizing another letter with predominantly with politicians, a number of members of the Houses of Lords and Commons, again, all part of a wider effort within the well, a now very broad progressive community that is seeking to put pressure on the government
Yeah.
to go far enough in its policies to ensure that all of those who, as I say, are falling through the net can be caught by something.
Yeah.
Because right now, what we're seeing very clearly is that however far Chancellor Sunak has gone, it's just not far enough.
Yeah.
The universal credit bureaucracy is already too slow. The money that has been promised to small business owners and sole traders isn't going to come through until June. Even furloughing at times is taking a long time to process. Basically speaking, however well-intentioned what we have seen from the government, it's just nowhere near enough, and millions of people are going to start going hungry if they're not already.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a sober thought that hopefully the audience will reflect on. I mean, we should really start with having a definition of universal basic income because,
Sure.
people will know about minimum wage, living wage,
Yeah.
but this is different. So maybe you can sort of give a bit of a definition,
Yep.
Neil, about what we're looking at here and what
Sure.
we're trying to achieve with UBI.
Absolutely, thank you. So the simplest way to understand a basic income, the way that I try to understand it and put it in ordinary terms, is that it's like a pension, only for everybody. Um, so in most Western societies, people over a certain age will receive a pension to sustain them when they're not working, right? The idea of a basic income is to do exactly the same, only for everybody. So it's a pension that is given unconditionally to all people on a regular, usually monthly basis, as a cash sum rather than as a token or anything else, and it's given on an individual basis. So as opposed to a parent for their children, it's given to all individuals, and there are various debates around how old you need to be in order to receive it. But the basic point is, and the basic purpose is, in a cash society, to give everybody that solid floor of cash in their pocket to stand on, to make sure that they neither go hungry nor will find themselves destitute if they don't accept some of the more awful kinds of work that are out there, or indeed if they can't work. These are sort of the first layer purposes of a basic income. But there are other deeper purposes, for example, to support people who want to go back and study further and retrain, but who otherwise may not be able to sustain themselves if they do.
Yeah.
Another purpose is to acknowledge and support care work. In reality, of course, women still do the majority of unpaid caring work in our societies.
Yeah.
And therefore, feminists of all stripes have said, look, a basic income would be one way of acknowledging, honoring the fact that care work is work, even if it's not paid.
Oh.
And indeed, that it would possibly open the door to allow more men to leave the world of paid work and enter the ranks of those who do the unpaid care labor that is the foundation of society. So the whole idea of basic income is to build a platform that more directly supports basic human needs from to be met in society, and that sort of moves us to a more caring society, basically a society that allows us to care for each other and have that acknowledged, and that enables people to engage with greater willingness in the labor market. In other words, not accepting any old job because it's the only job you can get, but accepting better jobs because you have the ability to refuse them.
I mean, you're obviously highlighting quite a few multifaceted issues surrounding universal basic income. I mean, the word universal presumably means that it is actually open to everybody,
Yes.
irrespective of their sort of age,
Yep.
to, presumably to cover different sized families, etc. So everybody will actually have a basic income.
Yep.
Now, do you have any feel for what that means in the UK? I mean, what kind of sort of figures would we be talking about in terms of a universal basic income?
There are various, and the econometric modelling that has been done, including by organisations like the RSA, the Royal Society of the Arts, basically positions the sort of amounts that the overall tax burden, of course, relates to the higher or the lower the amount of the basic income. So there are a variety of different estimates and models, and one of the critiques obviously is this is implausible, it's unaffordable, and so on and so forth. The studies that have been done by economists suggest that this could quite comfortably be funded by a more progressive taxation system, including higher taxes on the wealthy, In America, currently, there are great conversations amongst progressive circles about using a wealth tax to create a basic income. So in ordinary times, like any other social policy, it would just be part of the Chancellor's tax and spend remit. In the present times, when we're talking about things like helicopter money and the interest rates are so remarkably low that the government appears to have found the magic money tree that it said didn't exist, it's really implausible to suggest that the government couldn't lay its hands on the money that would be required to get ordinary people through this crisis. We know that hundreds of billions are being put aside to bail out business, and it's understandable that the government would be thinking of doing that. We therefore know that it has the capability, if it has the willingness, to do this also for people. So the figures vary, but the basic point is that a basic income isn't designed to make you rich. It's not there to give everybody the incentive to sort of sit on the bottoms and not do any work. That's not the point. The point is to give everybody this solid floor to stand on, and then enable people to choose more freely where they'd like to invest their energies. So it's enough to sustain you rather than put you on holiday, so to speak.
And have you got so far yet, Neil, as to sort of look at actually pound, shilling, and pence in terms of what that means for an individual?
Sure, not myself. No, I don't work with the macroeconomic figures. My work is much more fine-grained at the level of the individual and communities and how they're impacted by particular policies and what change particular policies would see in their lives, why they might be desirable. But there are a wide number of scholars who have done these calculations. Guy Standing is a particularly celebrated economist who has done a number. Again, people at the Royal Society of the Arts. So certainly, I mean, there are well-costed proposals which exist and have existed for some time.
I meant more in terms of the individual, rather than the sort of macroeconomic policy in terms of, if I'm a disadvantaged person and I'm living on the streets of Bath at the moment, for example, what would a universal basic income be for me? Would that be £200-300 a week? What would we look
again? Really varies, and ultimately the decision that gets made around this will be the result of conversation and debate. The proposal that I have enjoyed reading most recently, again, is the RSA's one, and what they have put forward is the idea for this emergency period of £1,000 a month, unconditionally given to everybody just to get them through. Whether or not that would go on to be the basis of a welfare system that continues in the non-crisis period, of course, is open for debate. But my sense is that that's the kind of figure that we want to be looking at in order to, certainly in this moment in time, enable people to get through, right? So yeah.
But from what you're just saying, Neil, I mean, you see this much longer term than just this immediate crisis. This is a not just a policy response to this particular COVID-19 crisis, but actually a different way of running a caring society.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, right now, whatever one thinks of basic income and its merits as a social policy, right now, some form of emergency UBI is utterly essential to get people through. Of this, I'm absolutely certain. And we know there is a vast body of evidence in the humanitarian field that shows that simple injections of cash are really effective tools, or is a really effective tool to get people through a crisis moment, because the market hasn't necessarily collapsed. What has collapsed is people's ability to access the goods that are in the market. To this extent, 10% of all humanitarian aid now comes in the form of cash. So there are sort of two debates. The right now, it's incontrovertible that this is a good idea, in my view. As a basis for sort of a better and a more caring society, yes, I do not consider basic income to be a panacea. I think that there are a variety of problems in our society, and a basic income can only address some of them. I also think it's absolutely vital, for example, that we have well-funded public services that are free at the point of access to everybody. And there are a whole number of other conversations that we can get in. But so long as we live in a cash society, to me, it seems I see no possible moral justification why we would not ensure that everybody has enough freedom to participate or withdraw their participation willingly from any aspect of society, and therefore no reason why we wouldn't have a basic income. The idea certainly is that a basic income, I mean, it's also just more efficient, right? We all know this. Tax lawyers exist for a reason, as do accountants. And a big part of that reason is we have a labyrinthine 5,000-page tax code that you need to be extremely well remunerated to be able to navigate and then step outside of, right? a basic income is just very efficient. Everybody gets it.
Yeah.
That's the end of the story. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some differential adjustments for example, if you have disabilities or if you have more children, whatever. But it's simple and effective and closes a lot of loopholes for either corruption or for bureaucratic failure.
Yes.
And that is one of the major attractions. Beyond that, of course, there is this moral push, I believe, towards a society that is set up to support people to have greater freedom and to support people to have more caring relations. Basically, when you live under the gun of not having enough money in your pocket, life is much less pleasant, and you have access within yourself to being able to be much less pleasant plenty of the time. A basic income kind of, its purpose is to take that pressure off people and give people a solid basis to participate in society from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the same financial advisors and accountants would invoke Karl Marx.
Absolutely.
When it comes to universal basic income, you know, by everyone according to their means, to everyone according to their needs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, this would be a very straightforward capitalist response.
Absolutely.
To this. So, how would you react to that?
No, I'm in complete agreement. You know, one of the within leftist thinking, plenty of folks are quite critical of a basic income because they quite rightly see it as this is not a communist policy. It is very much a capitalist policy, right? This is a policy that comes from the tax base and that seeks to support people to have a better life within this present system. Whatever one thinks of the merits of capitalism, and I certainly have many concerns about it and critiques of it, this is still, I think, nevertheless, a worthwhile step in the right direction of a more caring and supportive and mutually sustaining society. But yes, this is I think it has revolutionary potential to the extent that a basic income offers the possibility for really rebalancing life, basically. But that doesn't mean that it will necessarily destabilize the system in some radical fashion. No, I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's very helpful. I mean, let's go back to the Chancellor. Obviously, the government has reacted, and for a Tory government has sort of put in place unprecedented sort of interruptions in terms of interference in the market, so to speak.
Yep.
So, I mean, you know, there's some positives there, but the support package seems to be largely focused on those in work. In terms of and on the self-employed rather than people not in work. So, I mean, maybe you can just give me your take in terms of how effective the program that's been announced is likely to be.
Just nowhere near enough, very simply put. I read yesterday that of 21,000 businesses that were eligible to be applying for support with furlough, only 6,000 had been processed so far. So I just don't think it's anywhere near enough. It's also the case that the first economic measure was put in place 2 or possibly 3 weeks after this crisis began, by which time millions of people had already been laid off and millions of sole traders weren't able to earn. So, yes, it's impressive. It makes sense that the Conservatives have stepped in this quite radical direction. You know, there are reasons why they say that everybody becomes a socialist in a crisis, and the Tories certainly are demonstrating something akin to that. Of course, with nationalising the railways as well, but it's just nowhere near enough. The piecemeal nature of the responses that have been put in place simply do not cover everybody.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of the government response going forward, because obviously this crisis could be with us for a while, and the way that businesses react, it might be useful to talk a little bit about, Neil, about furloughing and what that actually means, because that will be helpful to our audience to understand.
Sure. So as far as I understand, furloughing is simply that a staff member will be kept on, unable to do any work, and the government will pay for that person to be retained up to 80% of their salary with a cap of £2,500. So basically, it's a government life support system for businesses and their workers to keep those businesses going and those workers in place for the duration of this crisis.
Okay, well, that's very helpful to know. Right, Neil. Yes, I mean, that's really interesting. One of the other things that the Chancellor, of course, is doing is helping businesses to furlough their employees to actually make sure that their cost base is reduced. I mean, would it be helpful? It would be helpful, actually, Neil, if you could just give literally maybe a minute or two's definition of furloughing, and in your view, how effective that will be going forward?
Sure. So my understanding is that furloughing basically works on the principle. I mean, it's like, you can understand it like a life support system. Basically, the government has promised to, for every worker that a company keeps on but cannot afford to pay, and therefore who will not do any work for the duration of the crisis, pay up to 80% of that worker's salary, to a cap of £2,500. So basically, the government is trying to do whatever it can through this particular policy to A, keep certain businesses afloat, and B, enable them to keep on their staff. So it's like a life support injection, and I commend them. It feels like this is a smart move, and at the same time, it remains wholly and grossly insufficient. Before this measure was even announced, millions of people had been laid off. Millions of people were already working on 0 hours contracts. Millions of people who are sole traders weren't able to earn and are still not able to earn. So for all this goes some way towards what is necessary, and indeed, like the core purpose at the heart of this policy, which is basically to sustain people and businesses materially, that's a sensible one. But I mean, that is the purpose really that the government needs to be making its own right now. But the reality is it's insufficient, because there are so many millions who will not be covered by this, who are not covered by this, and who are on the verge of going hungry.
Okay, now how difficult do you think, Neil, it would be for the government to actually extend that support package to universal basic income for all in the short term?
It's a good question. It would be a technical challenge, and certainly not beyond the government's capability. There are already a variety of different welfare architectures which exist, which could reasonably be weaved together. And I think in an emergency, you realize just how quickly the state machinery can move in order to be able to provide support. If not for everybody, for large segments of the population, and certainly for the most vulnerable. So frankly, I just do not see this being beyond the technical capability of a well-intentioned and purposeful government right now. It's not something that could be done immediately at the push of a button. It isn't the case that the government has everything set up so that it could literally press the button and everybody receives £1,000 in their account. No. There would require some work, which I imagine would take a couple of weeks, and would need to draw on the expertise of a variety of different branches of government and civil society. But this is certainly not beyond the government's capability, should it choose to go this route.
And what is your feeling? I mean, obviously you've now produced the open letter. It's been published in the Independent, etc. It's obviously got some traction.
Absolutely.
So what do you think? I mean, what is government's reaction? What have they said?
So far, they're basically holding the line. They're saying, we think that what we've put in place is going to be enough. We are working on other measures. Sunak's exact words were, we don't think that basic income is the right policy for this time. I would like to say that it will be inevitable that they will accept that this actually is the best policy and this is indeed desirable. I'm not wholly certain that they will. I think they are going to try to resist. I mean, a basic income, for the reasons I've discussed before, has the potential to be really transformative for the way a society operates.
Yeah.
And I think that there is fear around that transformation. It's a big thing to do. And I think it's also the case that humans, when confronted with massive change, massive difficulty, our instinct is to go back to what we know rather than to sort of leap radically into the unknown.
Yeah.
So I can understand that that's where they are. I think the reality is also that they're going to face increasingly massive amounts of pressure from across broad swathes of society. Within progressive communities, in labour unions, for example, big pillars of the establishment that were opposed to basic income are now starting to come out in favour because they recognise that this is an emergency. I think increasingly we will see that. Since we published our open letter, already 150 MPs signed an early day motion from all parties, I believe, except the Conservative Party, calling for this to happen. Now there are Conservative politicians also having conversations within cross-party groups around this. The pressure is growing, and it will only grow more intense as this crisis wears on. So I think it's going to be hard for them to hold on, not least because when lockdown ends, we're facing a recession, the likes of which none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for them to resist pressure towards this.
No, absolutely. But nobody really is talking about the long-term effect. You see the financial and economic figures in terms of, a third of GDP being wiped off in Q2.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We'll bounce straight back by the end of the year, and give us a sense really in terms of how this economic impact is likely to unfold over what period of time and how significant it will be.
I mean, it could be absolutely cataclysmic. I too have read things like a third of GDP disappearing, the likelihood that this could be a recession far greater than what was experienced in 1929 and onwards. Some are even suggesting this may be the end of capitalism itself. I mean, they're particularly because this is so fundamentally global. So I am in no way convinced that there's going to be a quick bounce back. Martin Wolf, who's the financial editor of The Times, himself also called for basic income to be part of the conversation. Now, the Times, as you know, is not a sort of a pillar of radical leftist thought, and yet their financial editor, and indeed the Financial Times, The Economist, major publications of the sort of financial establishment are recognizing that this has to be part of the conversation now, and that's largely because A, this is a presently speaking humanitarian disaster, and B, the scale of the recession that's coming is going to dwarf anything we've ever experienced. So to me, and indeed to much sager economic minds than mine, it seems fanciful to believe that we will be bouncing back by the end of the year, in which case we could be looking at a very, very long, prolonged period of crisis where
Yeah.
huge numbers of people aren't able to access what they need to get by. And one piece which I think is really significant in this is that this has hit the middle classes in a way that would previously have been unimaginable.
Right.
People who would ordinarily be considered as sort of bastions of the status quo, many conservative voters as
Yeah.
well, are themselves now without a job. And
Yeah.
when that happens, potentially powerful coalitions develop for change. So I think the government is going to have to contend with all of that. And if it believes that things are going to quickly go back to usual, it's in la la land.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, one of the things that you sort of painted is the government intervention in actually providing universal basic income in the short term
Mm,
to help with the current crisis. You then, in the sort of medium term, you need to restructure the tax system by from
mm,
what you were saying in terms of
mm,
having progressive taxes
absolutely.
where that could fund the universal basic income.
Indeed.
What about the sort of feedback and response from businesses to universal basic income?
Well, interestingly, I mean, the open letters that were signed were also signed by some business leaders as well, and as I mentioned, leaders of the sort of the public voice of business, publications like the Times or like the Economist or like the Financial Times, are also suggesting that this is going to be a potential part of the mix. Part of that, I think, acknowledges that we're facing a massive demand shock, right? People basically don't have enough money to buy anything. So even if businesses are open, who are they going to sell to? In this context, it makes a lot of sense, even from the perspective of a business that's trying to survive and might
Yeah.
not ordinarily be in favor of radical social policy. It makes a lot of sense that a potential customer base would have money in its pocket to be able to stimulate the demand that is necessary to match the
Yeah.
supply. So for me, it makes sense as a sort of sensible economic as well as social policy, number one. Number two, this is, I think, that the elephant in the room for all of us is climate change, right? We all know that we
Mm.
face potential climate collapse,
Yeah.
and that in addressing potential climate collapse, some of what we're experiencing now, some of the slowdown of what we're experiencing now is going to be necessary. Certain of the industries that aren't able to function now are going to need to be transitioned away and replaced by newer, greener industries.
Yeah.
This to me represents a really powerful opportunity, and not just to me, to millions of people. It represents a powerful opportunity to leverage in a much lower carbon transition. And a basic income, I think, is one way of supporting those who stand to lose in that transition.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So just to take a simple example, the petrochemical companies or the transport industry, aviation. Um, it's very easy for people on the green left to say, oh, look, we just need to shut these down and that's the end of it, move on to a transition. But of course, these are millions of jobs, these are millions of livelihoods, these are millions of families. A basic income, which would also be available for all of the people who are in these
Yeah.
industries, I think could be a useful leverage point for basically providing this safety net for
Yeah.
everybody who needs to be transitioned into different forms of productive activity that are compatible with a sustainable planet. So my sense is that this is not a business unfriendly policy, particularly from the perspective of business that is aware of the planetary crisis that we face. And it seems very apparent that most businesses are. Whether you are a big business owner or an ordinary person, you still live on the same planet, and you and your children and your grandchildren are going to be in a lot of trouble unless we transition to a post-carbon future. So this is, to me, something that could just as easily appeal to well-thinking, right-thinking,
Yeah.
progressive thinking business leaders as well.
Okay. No, I mean that makes sense. I mean, I'm putting my philosophical hat on now. I'm also the philosophy convener at the BLSI. I mean, doesn't all of this sort of just raise broader questions around what it means to be a society?
Absolutely. That's a beautifully put question. It does. I think this is fundamentally about, I mean, the two questions that are brought up by this whole crisis are like, what world do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to live in? And
Yeah.
how do we build it? To me, what's very apparent is that underneath all of the rubbish that typically circulates as political discourse, and underneath the alienation and separation of most people's lives, what most of us want is to live in a world of connection, of community, of belonging, where our needs are attended to,
Yeah.
where the systems that exist within our society are set up to support human flourishing. That's not the world that we currently live in. And I think what this crisis offers is a chance to transition towards that world.
Okay.
In which case, the question becomes, how do we leverage it into existence? Basic income, I think, in this sense, is useful for potentially leveraging in the new world. It's not the only thing that's necessary. And I think we need a national, indeed a global conversation about what the new world looks like and how we build it. But I'm certain that we want, as a species, to live in a society, in a world, a society of societies where our needs are attended to and where we flourish, which is not what we've got right now.
No, okay. Now, I mean, as a final question to you, I mean, obviously, we're talking about universal basic income, we're talking about the philosophical notion of what is society. The last question really is about what can we do practically at the moment as individuals, given that UBI, universal basic income, hasn't been introduced yet.
Yeah,
There are learnings, however, from other countries like Finland and
yeah,
India. So
absolutely.
maybe you can briefly talk to that, and then let's finish off with what can we do as individuals right now until such a safety net actually exists. What could we
Absolutely.
all do individually to help?
Thank you. Great question. Yes, there is, for anybody watching, listening, there is a lot of data out there from a number of trials that have now taken place in the global north and the global south, which point to the many positive impacts that a basic income can have socially and economically. And I would urge people to get on the internet to Google those. There are plenty of sites which have begun aggregating that. One is an emergency basic income website, but there are a variety of others. Now, what can we do individually? I mean, to me, there are two basic focuses that we can have here. One is in mutual aid, support your communities, get to know your neighbors, whether that means putting
Yeah,
something through your neighbor's door or joining a street's WhatsApp group.
yeah,
Do what you can to connect with those around you, to offer each other emotional support and then any other support that is required, specifically focusing on those who have different kinds of vulnerabilities and have different
yeah,
kinds of needs. That feels like the most vital first step. Secondly, get active politically. You know, write to your MP, check what local campaign groups are
yeah,
doing. Um, Look in the press, for example, for things like open letters that may give you an indication of which
yes,
campaigning organization, which set of individuals is wishing to put pressure on our leaders. Maybe write things yourselves, maybe
yeah,
host conversations with your community. If you're business leaders, have a conversation. How do we feed the millions of people who aren't
yeah,
going to get fed? What do we think about our basic income? Um, in relation to basic income specifically, um, I would suggest looking for basic income conversation.
yeah,
That number of civil society groups in the UK have put together a little toolkit for having conversations around what a basic income
yeah,
might look like. Likewise, there are organizations that are supporting and now advocating for using this moment to transition into a greener economy.
yeah,
Bodies like Green New Deal, or of course also Greenpeace, see what they're doing. Right?
yeah.
Like now is the time to see what these individuals and organizations are doing and to connect your efforts to theirs.
Excellent. Well, listen, I mean that's a fantastic place to stop, and hopefully our conversation will be amplified on YouTube and on the BLSI website to for people to start engaging in the same kind of conversation and actually doing something that they can make a contribution at a time like this. So,
Absolutely.
Neil, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure.
And I hope you all enjoyed this particular conversation with Neil. I think it provides lots of food for thought. And if you could share the outtakes from this conversation with others, I think that we would make sure we can progress to universal basic income sooner rather than later. There's much more of this kind of material on the BLSI website related to business and economics, to science, to all other types of subjects. So if you want to find out more, please visit www.brlsi.org, and there will be lots of information across different convener groups for you to digest and absorb. See you next time. Bye-bye.